when we get bombarded with this confusing information, we tend to get paralyzed. Maybe the safest thing to do is do nothing. But climate change is real. It is here. And there is hope. All right, this afternoon I'm going to be talking about climate change in New England. And climate change can at times be a often misunderstood topic. So what I'm going to do is spend some time to try to demystify a little bit of climate change and what's going on here across New England. The first thing that I want to do is start with looking out into the future, and then I'll work back here to the present. And a lot of people talk about climate change in terms of what the impact is going to be out in 2100. And I don't usually talk about that because I'm not going to be alive in 2100, and it's really hard for me to internalize it based on that. So I like to talk about 2050 because I'm still hoping I'm going to be around come 2050. But that's a goal. Yes, that is a goal. So a couple of things to think about. In 2050, the average temperature here in New England will have risen from now by about 5 degrees. The average water temperature in areas like the Massachusetts Bay and the Long Island Sound will also increase by about 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Those don't sound like all that high numbers, but they're devastating to the wildlife and the natural ecosystems that are going on. But let's take that a step forward. When we talk about things getting warmer, by 2050, we'll have, instead of 4 on average 90-degree days a year, we'll have 48, or in the area of 48 90-degree days a year in the summertime. We'll have significantly more rain events, and those rain events already are packing about 70% more moisture in them than they used to, again, because of the effects of climate change. And then the last part is the air is getting warmer, the oceans are getting warmer. That translates to sea level rise. And our sea levels have already risen somewhere between 8 to 10 inches as a result of climate change. By 2050, they will have increased yet another 20 inches. So let's look at that for Norwell, because Norwell is a low-lying area of Massachusetts. And this is Norwell today. And what you can see on the map is those green areas are flood risk areas when there's heavy precipitation. Now let's look at 2050. The red area are the areas that will now be on high tide, have more water in them. So you can see where the inlets here were narrower, they're much broader, and they've expanded into some of the areas that were just potential flood risks in the past. Oh. And then let's look a little further. Let's look at those floodplains. They changed colors when I did the maps, but the floodplains themselves have now grown. So smaller floodplains have now all grown together in different places to show that the floods and the water levels are going to be more serious in 2050. And I zoomed in here just to look at an area you can see on one of these inlets. There used to be, right here, this was a peninsula. And in the middle of this, it's hard to see, but there's actually a house on that. In high tide, that's going to be an island in 2050. Certainly hope whoever's watching this isn't the person who has that house on that new island. But hey, you've got an island of your own now. Private island. That's right. So last year was a real challenge for climate change. In 1 year, so last year alone, looking at New England, we had severe drought last fall. You can see how the severe drought area covered almost all of Massachusetts, the northwestern part of Connecticut, and a significant part of southern New York and New Jersey as well. I was backpacking on the New England Trail at that time, and I was struggling every day to find water that I could actually filter for drinking, all while I was backpacking on the New England Trail. That drought then translates to wildfires. So at one point during October last year, these red spots all of those wildfires were burning at the same time across Massachusetts, which then you have drought that turns into wildfires, which then turns into air pollution, because all of that particulate is in the air now and causing respiratory issues for people throughout the state. But in my hometown in Monroe and the surrounding towns last August, we had 15 inches of rain that wasn't forecasted in less than 24 hours that wiped out parts of the towns.
Where was that place?
It's Monroe, Southbury, Oxford areas of Connecticut. We had up to 15 inches of rain in less than 24 hours.
Was it sort of equivalent to what Vermont was like?
Vermont has had a lot of those, yes. And what happens is the warm air carries so much moisture that it's just a massive outletting of moisture, and the rain just turns into massive floods. But we had golf ball size hail in one of the storms that wiped out farms throughout central Connecticut. Golf ball size hail is what normally happens in the Midwest.
You took that picture?
No, that wasn't me. That was not me. And along the coast here in Massachusetts and Connecticut, we've got coastal storms and the sea level rise that's causing significant erosion and coastal inundation along the coast. So all of this is happening in 1 year, and it's something that we can expect to happen more often year over year. But there's ripple effects from that. So we've got these impacts of climate change that are now causing issues with biodiversity loss in our areas because of the warmth and the moisture brings in new pathogens. We hear about, tick disease with our moose because the ticks aren't getting killed off in the wintertime. In the summertime, we have many more mosquito-borne diseases that are happening because mosquitoes love warm, moist weather. And we're also losing many types of plants as a result. And the other side of it is these invasive species love this warm, moist weather. But those rainstorms overwhelm our sewer systems. So we end up having sewage discharges into our riverways and our waterways as a result of that, and our communities are being flooded at the same time. The other thing that we're seeing is with forest fragmentation, both because of the issues from climate change killing off a lot of our native species of plants, but also because of overdevelopment. It's a whole lot harder to see on here, but you can see straight up through the middle of Connecticut and Massachusetts where there's a lot of development. There's very little contiguous forest. And also on the eastern side of Massachusetts as well as Rhode Island, very little contiguous forest. The dark green is what we want to look for because those dark green areas are contiguous forest, which our wildlife need large amounts of contiguous forest to flourish. And as a result, everywhere that you see fragmentation, you also see endangered species cropping up more and more. Between plants, insects, birds, and animals are all becoming more endangered because of the fragmentation that's happening, both because of development as well as because of the climate change that's impacting it. So why is all this happening? I am not a climate scientist. I'm not an environmental scientist. I'm a person who's gotten involved in this because I've cared, but I had to sit down and try to reason this out for myself, which is one thing we know is our planet's warming. We can see it, we can feel it, but that has effects. So with our planet warming, that warmer air holds more moisture. So now what happens is with that warmer air holding more moisture, there's more surface evaporation coming out of the ground and also coming out of our streams and lakes and rivers. And that causes prolonged drought because more water can keep being pulled up into the atmosphere before it needs to be let back out. So we have prolonged droughts, which then stresses plants, stresses animals, stresses insects. And then when it rains, we have significant rain events. So we're into these drought deluge cycles that happen. Long periods of drought, lots of rain afterwards causes damage, back to another drought or at least a dry spell. And all of this leads to inland flooding. And then we've got the other side. That warming planet, thank you to our oceans, but the oceans absorb 90% of all of the heat that's happening as a result of global warming. Problem with that is we all know that warm oceans fuel tropical storms. And we also know that we've got that warm air, which retains more moisture, so it also causes these storms to pack more moisture into them, like Hurricane Helene last year. And then finally, one of the things we learned in elementary school science is that when you warm something up, whether it be a liquid or a solid or a gas, when you warm it up, it expands. Our oceans are expanding because they're getting warmer. So that, forget about the glaciers melting or the ice sheets melting, just the oceans getting warmer themselves means sea level rise is happening not only because of that, but that is a major contributor to it as well. And of course, all of that leads to coastal flooding and coastal inundation as well. So when you look at global warming, it has these effects of drought deluge cycles, inland flooding, and both coastal flooding and coastal inundation, which are some of the big things that when we talk about climate change, those are the things that are actually occurring to us. So with all this happening, it almost seems nonsensical to, if this is happening, why aren't we doing something to change faster? Because we all care about clean air to breathe and having clean water to drink and having healthy communities and a safe environment for our children and our grandchildren to grow up in. And we all want these thriving ecosystems out there. So why in the world aren't we changing? And there's a simple answer to that, which is there is so much disinformation out there today on climate change and on global warming that it creates confusion. I hear things on a regular basis that confuse me and I have to go try to figure out. But for all of us, it's human nature that when we get bombarded with this confusing information, we tend to get paralyzed, pull back, and even say, well, if I can't figure out who's telling me the truth and what the truth is, maybe the safest thing to do is do nothing. But climate change is real. It is here. And there is hope. And that's what I'm going to talk about next, which is what we can do, how we can get into action. And when we think about two more premises to think about here. One is, if you think about in a natural environment, this is me on the New England Trail, struggling to find water probably at this time. When the rain comes down in a natural environment, most of that rain that comes down is absorbed into the ground. Half of the rain that comes down is absorbed right into the ground. Very little of it runs off, and that's good because it gets held there, and then the rest of it that does evaporate, evaporative cooling helps to cool the environment. So evaporation is good. Runoff is bad. Now let's think about cities and places where there's a lot of development. That pavement and the concrete that's out there, all of those impermeable surfaces. Now, in those areas, there's far less water that gets absorbed. Over half of it is runoff. And what that runoff does is it picks up pollutants off the streets and off of different areas. It picks up garbage, and it washes it all into the storm drains. The storm drains are overwhelmed, which then leads to both polluting our water sources, but also local flooding in those areas. So, organizations like Save the Sound and the Appalachian Mountain Club, we work on a larger scale for how we deal with these things. We're focusing on things like aquatic connectivity loss, biodiversity issues, coastal erosion, and coastal flooding. And the way we do that is we focus on larger projects like removing old dams that are no longer serving the purposes that they were created for, and turning those back to allow the rivers to flow the way that they used to so that fish can migrate back to their native spawning places. We also look at tidal estuary places and we rebuild those tidal marshes through beneficial dredging. We also focus on those culverts that are out there. Culverts are really cheap to put out there for overpasses for roadways to be able to travel over, but they're terrible for biodiversity connectivity. Animals and fish don't want to go through those little culverts. So when we move to broader fishways and bridges, the animals and the turtles and the reptiles that like to migrate along riverways and stream beds, they can do that. And also we focus on the coast and bringing in living shorelines to be able to protect those shores from either the coastal storms or the inundation that happens from sea level rise. But then you can focus on the community level. Groups like the Appalachian Mountain Club's different Connecticut chapters, Massachusetts chapters, like the one that Zoe here is a member of, the Southeastern Massachusetts chapter. Smaller groups can work on doing things like creating rain gardens, building rain gardens at people's homes, building rain gardens in areas of a town. Whoops. I have no idea what I just did. Here we go. We're back. Building rain gardens in the middle of a more metropolitan area to capture some of that runoff. Building bioswales in areas to capture even more, or looking at doing something that I love that some of the Massachusetts chapters do is having depaving parties, taking out some of those impermeable surfaces where they're no longer needed and bringing it back to being natural. And then there's on the personal level. I'm not going to go through all of this, but if anyone wants to, you can scan the LinkedIn article, the QR code there, which goes far more in depth of what I've written in these areas. But I'm going to touch on a couple of topics quickly. The first one is engage locally, like these events. Come to these events. Talk about the environment. Talk about the environment and your concern for it with your legislators. Talk about it with your friends and your family and ask them to talk to legislators about it. Also, use your money to speak for you. Look at this organization or this site here called Green America. It helps you understand which banks, which investments, which credit cards are greener so that you can put your money in places where they're working towards the environment as opposed to against the environment. I'll talk plastic is such a tough topic. I know it's hard to get plastic out of your daily life, but the thing that you can do most is focus on eliminating single-use plastics. That's where you can really have an impact, because there's plastic in so many different things that you don't have a choice of what you're going to buy and what you're not going to buy. But focus on single-use plastics if you can't look at anything else. And recycling. Recycling too. In America, we have ruined recycling. We feel so good about putting things into our recycling bin that we're doing a good thing, but 95% of all the plastic we put into our recycling bin still ends up either in a landfill, being burned, or dumped in the ocean. And 2/3 of everything that we put into our recycling bins has the same fate. But in my article, I do talk about ways that you can bring those numbers up, but also just think about it in a different term. Think about it in terms of refusing things that you don't need. Do you really need some of the things that you're looking at? So refuse first, reuse, repurpose, and then considering as a last result, recycling. And I'm not going to talk about anything on the other side because Peter's going to come up and talk about how we green things and we address that, but also just think about a more sustainable diet. There's such significant impacts of what it is that you include in your diet, and I talk about it a whole lot more here. So, if this has motivated you to do something, but you're not sure what, think about what your climate action needs to be. And if you've ever been familiar with the Japanese term ikigai, which is talks about what your purpose in life is on doing something good, this is can be your own personal climate ikigai. Think about, first of all, what brings you joy? And then what are you good at? And when you put that together with, from a climate perspective, what needs doing, where that all intersects in the middle, think about it, look at it, that is what your climate action should be.
Well, thank you very much, first and foremost, to the Norwell Public Library. Really grateful to be a part of this, and thank you, Zoe, for putting it together, and Scott and Ray. Awesome topics, and everything that you just talked about has been something that I've been observing for too long, really, and it really is time for change. And so I am excited to talk to you about things that I am very passionate about, and it's something that I've been given this opportunity to be able to take some action. and we're going to be trying to do it on a large scale by starting small. So Fox Rock Farms is based out of Norwell, Massachusetts. Our bogs are in Kingston, and our mission is to build community through education and food accessibility. We strive to educate people on the importance of natural habitats, pollination systems, and organic practices through hands-on experience. And we hope our produce and wildflower honey will deepen your connection to your food and where it comes from. All right, so here's some pictures from our apiaries from one of our original places. We're going up to over 400 hives this year, and I think an important note about honeybees is that they're of European descent, and what is very important about that, as Scott even talked about a little bit, is invasive species. And we really need to think about the honeybee as livestock, as something that helps us pollinate huge amounts of areas, and that's where really our connection with the honeybee is derived, is pollinating our food so that we can eat. We also get the honey and we can make wax products from them, but it's important for us to think of them as livestock and not as a way of repopulating pollinators and so forth. We do have some research out of Cornell that we've been kind of following that suggests that if we put honeybees in small densities and areas and then pair them with a diverse selection of native plants, that they kind of can act as a Kickstarter into actually pollinating these plants and then making them more available over the course of a 5-year period, which is really where when we talk about bee repopulation efforts and all of our profits of our farm going into bee repopulation. So far, and since the beginning of the farm, we have installed 14,500 one-gallon native plants that are native to southeastern Massachusetts, and they are geared towards the most at-risk pollinators in this area. So I want to talk a little bit about what biodiversity and pollination systems is, because this reframes the idea of what a pollinator actually is. So instead of thinking of the animal, I want you to think about the plant and the pollinator together as a pollination system. So that a pollination system is a plant and all of its pollinators. So you might see in the picture over on the left, has anybody ever wondered to themselves why flowers all look so different from one another? The purpose of the flower really is for pollination, and pollination is pollen making it from one plant to the same species of plant. So really what's happened over eons, and this is fairly recent discovery, is that the plants have been selecting their pollinators, not the other way around. They've done little specifications to try to get a specialist rather than a generalist. In the top right corner you can see a hummingbird, and this is actually my favorite example of plants choosing pollinators, because the color red is perceived as a gray to insects and bees, so it's made itself a little bit more invisible to the bee population and other insects. Hummingbird has no problem seeing the color red. Additionally, the shape of the flower matches the shape of the beak of the hummingbird, and you can see the top, there's the pollen right there, which comes in contact with the forehead of the hummingbird when it comes along. So now that pollen is going to be on the forehead of the hummingbird. It goes to the next flower and likely going to choose the same one, and now we have pollination and the flower is able to go. Now if a bee went there, a honeybee being the ultimate generalist, the chances of it going to that flower and then to another flower and another flower, it's definitely possible. So the plant really wants a specialist. So this framework really makes you think of the plant in this picture. So this brings up, flower visitors versus pollinators. A flower visitor does not pollinate, but it feeds off of the pollen and the nectar of the plants, and this can be considered parasitic in some cases because it can prevent the plant from being able to reproduce. And again, going back to our hummingbird here, we like to put out, the hummingbird feeders for ourselves, but actually it's taking away from the pollination services that this bird does provide, and it creates a center for disease because they're all visiting the same place. The hummingbird feeders are a much more accessible food source, and so they're going to go to that instead of the plants, and then again we start getting less and less plants. But what's really interesting too about these pictures is in the bottom right was the cardinal plant, like I first showed you on the left, is bee balm. Both of these are native plants to southeastern Massachusetts. And what you notice is that the shape of the flower is actually relatively close, and the shade of the color is relatively, so now this plant has chosen the same pollinator. So how has the plant then evolved to be able to work together with its ecosystem? They flower at 2 different times of year for 2 different weeks. So they've selected the same pollinator, and in order to increase the chances of pollination, they've changed the time of the season in which they bloom. So I want to help you guys choose some of the plants for your yard, because this is something that we like to look at space and just decide what might look beautiful out there, and then we don't have a lot of success with plants, and that's discouraging. And we want to have success when we plant in a diverse way. So first, you want to know your soil type, and a ribbon test is a really good way to do this. Take a little piece of your soil, spray it with a little bit of water, mix it around in your hand, and then between your pointer finger and your thumb, you start to create a ribbon. Now, if it just kind of falls apart, then you've got some sandy loam. If it kind of creates a little bit, about an inch to 2 inches, you've got a nice sandy clay loam, maybe some silt mixed into there. Depending on the texture that you have in there, you can determine that based on the ribbon length. And then in 2 inches or more, you have a sandy clay loam, silty clay, or clay there. Sand has a tendency to have water just kind of go through it. It doesn't hang on to a lot of nutrients. So it is relevant to know that you're going to want a plant that can thrive in those conditions. If you put a plant in that is a really heavy feeder, then it's not going to be too happy unless you're adding lots and lots of fertilizer. Additionally, we can think about the hours of sunlight in an area. And Lumos is a really fun app that I like to use. This, you can stand in a place and it actually tells you where the sun is in the sky in the direction you point at it. So if you're getting less than 2 hours of direct sunlight, then you're getting considered in a shady area. 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight is partial, and more than 6 hours of direct sunlight is considered full. It's also important to think about that it doesn't have to be consecutive. So you can have 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, there's your 6 hours, and you have full sun. So we want to think about that because plants do like different types of sunlight conditions. So there we go. So we have been working with Dr. Robert Jagier out of UMass Dartmouth, and at first this is a lot to take in here. But what he's done is a project called Beecology, and he has his grad students actually go out and take pictures of pollinators on the different flowers. And this is actually something that you can participate in. When you go to his website, you can take a picture of that pretty flower that has a pollinator on it, send it in, and this list is completely data driven. And what he's been able to find out is over 10 years of research that there's ecological matches between a pollinator and its plant. And we can actually identify what pollinators that we want to help by putting specific plants out there. So what you can see is the botanical name all the way to the left. The common name is what you'll probably go to the nursery and ask for. And the plant type gives you an idea of its growth habit. So perennials coming back every year, staying small, shrubs, intermediate in size, and then trees, of course, get large. Tells you that particular plant's sunlight preference, the soil conditions in terms of moisture of what it likes in there, and then the time of year in which it's going to bloom, M starting with March and O being October. The three bumblebees here, Bombus terricola, Furvitus, and vagans, are the most critically endangered bumblebees that are in this particular area. So if you have purple next to it, then you know that that's a flower that particular species can take advantage of, so you can help the most critically endangered. There's a separate list for butterflies, and other bees would be our honeybees. So as I go through and select our pollinator garden plants, I go through and make sure that I'm picking plants that span over the course of the entire season, putting extra emphasis on early and late season plants. And then I like to make sure that all three of our at-risk bumblebees are able to take advantage of it, as well as our honeybees together. So this one you can see is pollen sources, and on our website, foxrockfarms.com, you can go and find a link to this plant list, and it's separated into pollen sources, nectar sources, and host plants. And we like to create a diverse selection between that. As Scott touched on a little earlier, biodiversity is key to this entire thing because it starts with the plant, and then as you get more plants, you get more insects. More insects means more birds, and it goes all the way up to the top of the food chain. So in order to make a huge impact, sometimes it starts with the smallest things. You put in one native plant, you help that one native pollinator, and you can make a big impact. So this is nectar sources here. What I'd like to do is draw your attention to the salix over here, your willows. We like to think of, the big weeping willow, but that's actually not one of the native ones here. So pussy willows are one of my favorites. They're of a particular importance because of how early they bloom. All your pollinators are waking up right now. It's been a long, cold winter. And the willows will provide both pollen and nectar, which keeps the adults going and allows them to make baby bees. So you just have to be cautious about them a little bit because their roots are quite aggressive, so don't put them near your septics or water sources, that kind of thing. Nice open wet areas, and they do quite well. So here's a quick example for sun. You can cover all the seasons. Early, some serviceberry, eastern redbud and lupin. Middle is flowering raspberry, Joe Pye weed, black-eyed Susan, spotted bee balm, and penstemon. Late is spotted St. John's wort, calico astards, showy goldenrod, purple giant hyssop, and sneezeweed. Purple giant hyssop, the first time I brought that onto a property, it was maybe 3 minutes that it was off the truck and I had bees coming out of nowhere. And this is where my field of dreams analogy always comes in. Plant it and they will come. It really is that easy. Just put it there, and these things that you don't see on a regular basis just come out of the woodwork, literally. So here's a nice example of shade. Holly, spicebush, bleeding heart, wild geranium. I want to draw attention back to the American holly real quick. These are actually more tree-like in structure. They get quite large. So you should consider that, because when we go to the nursery and we ask for holly, oftentimes it's blue holly, which stays nice and short so we can put it next to our house. That is not a native species. So if you're trying to stick with natives, make sure you're requesting the American holly. Northeastern beard tongue and mountain laurel are beautiful. Mountain laurel, I've seen that under, dense canopies, almost in complete shade, and still blooming. Same late is the smooth goldenrod, large-leafed aster. Funny thing about goldenrod for us, a lot of people think they have allergies to it, but I believe it's sneezeweed that's out at the same time, and they're actually allergic to that and not the goldenrod. And I always know when my bees are going to goldenrod because I open up the cover and it smells like dirty socks. It's kind of like a stinky cheese. It smells bad, and then you taste it and you're like, wow, this is delicious. But our honey, it's been interesting as I've been doing this and introducing biodiversity. Our honey has a completely unique flavor every batch that I do, because it's completely dependent on the nectar that they're foraging on. So I'm starting to be able to identify flavors of certain plants, which is really cool. Linden trees are actually one of my favorite flavors of honey, really a nice flavor. So a lot of us don't have the luxury of having huge yards, multiple acreage, to be able to do this, and finances to be able to plant, these plants on a huge scale. So if you've got a small yard and you're short on space, Dr. Jagier would say bulk up on early and late season flowers, because this is when the pollinators are coming out, and this is when they're going back into dormancy. Give them food before winter and food right as they're coming out of it. And then of course willows, goldenrod, asters, Asclepias and dandelion are definitely ones that you'd like to incorporate. The monarch butterfly, which has been fluctuating in and off of the endangered species list. Its larval state completely depends on milkweed, and even through its huge migration, you'll find species of native milkweed all along the way. So it's completely dependent on that one. If you have goats or other livestock, it's good to keep them away from milkweed. It is toxic to them. And as I mentioned earlier, careful with those willows, but they're good. So here's some design and maintenance. The way that we've installed our pollinator gardens is every square foot for forbs. Forbs is another term for perennials, and auger to preserve the turf. This actually had a wonderful outcome for us. I had to make this decision whether we wanted to clear the land or whether we wanted to work with the turf that was existing there. And I decided for water and erosion reasons and the native turf that was there, it was better to try to preserve it. So we augured these holes, and the next season after we did this, a species of grass came up, and since we didn't mow it, it went to flower. And Japanese beetles emerged in June, and they were completely drawn to the seeds and the pollen of that grass. And I was able to put out pheromone traps and catch them all before they went to my crops. Had I not done this, they would have made their way to my crops and destroyed my crops. And so it ended up becoming like a trap crop for us. So we let that section of grass, flower every year. And in years of rain, it's remarkable. We got a lot of grass growth, but our plants still persisted. And then last year, where we didn't, we had extreme drought, which is the cycles that you were just talking about, Scott. We saw a lot more of the flowers coming up and less grass growth last year, but it does balance itself out, and they don't choke each other. So really starting to resemble a meadow again. So it was really exciting for us. It's also important to create a 3-year mowing rotation. A lot of the native bees will actually reproduce in the stalks of other plants. And so what ends up happening is it takes 2 years for them to actually complete that reproduction phase. So by splitting this into 3 mowing regiments, once a year in November, we do 1/3 of the plot, and that rotation allows those species to be able to reproduce. Seed balm around the plants if you can. That helps with the success rate. So where do we want to get these seeds? Prairie Moon and Ernst seeds I've had a really good time with. This is one of the most cost-effective ways for you to be able to introduce biodiversity into your yard. One thing I want to draw attention to is the germination code. So C30 actually means that it needs to be in a freezing environment for 30 days, and D means light. There is a key for this germination code, and it's on their website, so don't feel overwhelmed by this. But you have to mimic certain things that happen naturally out in the environment in order to unlock the germination of these plants. So then it'll also tell you their advantages, how it'll help, and the USDA zones, which unbelievably, touching again on what Scott talked about, when I first started with plants 20 years ago, we were a plant zone of 5, and last year we were just listed as a 7A, and that's a remarkable change in temperature and average temperature over a 10-year period. So taking complete note of that. So where to get these plants? We are in Norwell, so a lot of these I've focused on where we can get them in Massachusetts. Every Bloomin' Thing, I worked there for 18 years. It's just down the street from here, and they're constantly bringing in native plants. One thing I'd like to talk about that when you're sourcing these from nurseries is pulling into the terms nativar and cultivar and straight species. Straight species would mean any plant that's been here pre-colonial times, so something that's actually been here and it's the direct lineage from those plants. Nativar would be something that we would hybridize for one reason or another from a native plant that's here. Sometimes we want more flowers, sometimes we don't want it to produce fruit, sometimes we want the fruit to be bigger. And so I had a conversation with Dr. Jagir about this one time. I said, so what's the deal? Can we use nativars, or do we need to stick to straight species? And his answer to me was, as long as the nativar fulfills its ecological duty, it's okay to include them. So an example of it not fulfilling its ecological duty is winterberry. Beautiful plant, flower, and a berry that the birds take advantage of. But we like those berries, and we've made them bigger so that we can enjoy them for the holidays. Coincidentally, this made the berry too big for the bird that ate it, and it could no longer eat it. Therefore, the plant's no longer fulfilling its ecological duty. Now let's take another example of different, sunflowers or hydrangeas, native hydrangeas. We wanted to increase the amount of blooms on them so we could enjoy them. Same amount of pollen and nectar is there, and it's at the same time of season it normally blooms and only blooming once. So therefore it fulfills its ecological duty, and it's okay to actually incorporate them into your native pollinator gardens by this standard. So just a little interesting there. Native Plant Trust, beautiful place to go and take a nice walk. You can get your plants there, but they also have these as 30-year-old specimens, so you can see established pollinator gardens, and it's a nice walk in. You can walk away with the plants that you see. Dragonfly Natives is sticking with straight species, and they're growing all their own plants, so they're not using any synthetic fertilizers and composts in the plants that they're growing there, and they're based out of Norwell, so we love sourcing a lot of our plants from there. And Dragonfly Natives is a wholesale, and they started Blue Stem Natives and then went to a wholesale, and they're actually growing all of our pollinator plants for us every year out of South Dartmouth. This year we're slated for another 5,000 plants to be installed, and they're in 1 gallon size, which helps increase. I like to plant more in the fall because we get sometimes the fall rains, not last year, but in general we get the dew return and we get the rain to help us get them to establish. So some places, willows, really cost-effective way is to go to Vermont Willow Nursery, and they send them to you as stakes. It's literally the size of your pencil. Stick it in the ground. See you later. See a nice big willow tree later on, and sometimes sourcing multiple plants for under $30. So good way to go. These are some pictures of our friends out there. You see them out there, and I really urge you to reconsider your urge to slap them and get rid of them. We have thousands of species of bees, some ground nesting, some in cavities. Every one of these matching with a different flower, an ecological match right here. Many wasps, in fact, don't even have stingers. They've just evolved to look mean because it worked for the hornets. But it's actually just their reproductive organ. Let them go along. They're pollinators, and I haven't had to use chemicals around my tomatoes in multiple years now because there's parasitic wasps. We've attracted them through fennel and dill, and they come and they lay their eggs in the tomato hornworms, and we come and we see all these eggs in mummified tomato hornworms and basically have no damage just by letting them persist. So we see these guys and you start to rethink our relationship with them and how they contribute to the entire ecosystem. We continue to try to expand. This is really the infancy of this farming endeavor. We're really trying to add more locations and pair our honeybees with cranberries. And the thing that's been good is we're providing bees at no charge for cranberry growers with the intention of having them rethink the things that they're using to protect their crops, increase biodiversity. The same parasitic wasps that we're using at, taking advantage of, I guess, at our farm would control a lot of the same pests. The cranberry is native to Massachusetts, in particular the variety that we grow, House. And with that comes the entire ecosystem that we just talked about of pollinators and the forces that would control the food. I make a fishing analogy oftentimes of if you go fishing and you have no bait, you're very unlikely to catch a fish. So if I use a broad spectrum insecticide and just kill everything, what incentive does the predator have to come to my property? It has no incentive because there's no food. So I need to create a balance and reestablish that balance. And I'd like to, draw that attention to a lot of people, especially in our industry, that if you give it some time, Mother Nature's created a lot of relationships of checks and balances, and we just have to go off of appropriate thresholds, some for them, more for us. So thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it.
So with the farm,
Yes.
you grow all of these plants for the benefit of your bees.
That's correct. Yes, our bees and the native pollinators too. So that's really when we talk about we're trying to do bee repopulation, we're specifically talking about the native bees. The honeybees give us a way to start that conversation, allow us to help agriculture and encourage more sustainable practices at farms. So.
It's amazing the effort you go into to create the ecosystem for your bees to thrive.
Yeah, it's a lot less work for us too. I can tell you that when you create that, and a lot of beekeepers are making huge investments into sugar and water every year, and they're feeding their bees just that because they're putting too many bees in an area, and they're not making an investment into plants. But the interesting thing that you can see right away is if you make the investment into these plants once, then they get pollinated, and every year you're getting actually more and more food available for your bees. So we're not just feeding our bees once with this investment, but for years and years, as well as other populations. We let the deer run through there, they eat the plants. Guess what, these plants don't die. I mean, they're not next to my house, but they just keep regenerating. They still usually flower in the same year, and they might need and depend on that deer to spread its seeds, in fact. You never know, because of the relationships are so intricate between all things, and that brings me back to biodiversity always. Be as diverse as possible, have as many different species working together, because that's the whole web, of everything. So, thank you. No, thank you.
Makes better honey too.
It's delicious. But I have to
it's
say
better
though,
for
if you
your
find
allergies, that's
it does help. And I have to say though that if you find a flavor of our honey that you like, you should get 2 jars because it never tastes the same.
So if you haven't heard of the Appalachian Mountain Club, the Appalachian Mountain Club is an 150-year-old organization. It's the nation's oldest conservation and recreation nonprofit. And our mission is to connect people to the outdoors and to protect critical landscapes that we all love to play in. So recently, AMC created a new strategic plan to guide our work from 2025 until 2030. And these are 2 of the, I have a, I don't have a laser. Okay.
Oh, you do. Use the little button underneath the little trigger. There you go.
Ah, okay.
It's not very bright.
Thank you. So we have a new strategic plan, and 2 of the key performance indicators that are most important to my work are protecting critical landscapes for the well-being of people in the outdoors, and this means creating new sources of public funding to permanently protect lands that are important to us. So this is like expanding the White Mountain National Forest, protecting AMC's work in the 100-mile Maine wilderness and expanding our conservation areas there. Some of the landscapes I'm focused on are the Connecticut River watershed, And then I also am focused on fostering access to the outdoors for everyone. And this looks like 2 different things. And this is working in solidarity with organizations that are focused on bringing marginalized people outdoors, organizations that are based in urban areas, that work with people of color, that work with people with disabilities. And then also advocating to make sure the public funding that I just talked about here is actually distributed equitably to communities across the state and the country. So next I'm going to talk about how we approach our advocacy work at the Appalachian Mountain Club. So we mostly do advocacy through 4 different ways. And so the first way is coalitions, and coalitions are groups of like-minded organizations, or maybe not so like-minded organizations, coming together to advocate collectively for a goal. AMC, typically me and other members of the policy team, we lead coalitions and we manage and organize the ones that are the most relevant to our work related to land conservation and trails funding. So I organize the Common Trails Coalition here in Massachusetts and the Northeast Forest Network, which is a regional coalition of forest advocacy organizations. And then we participate in many, many, many more coalitions to continue getting information sharing, learning about what legislative vehicles are moving, and important moments to act for the outdoors. Other things we do are direct lobbying. This is mostly what I do. This is working one-on-one with legislators and decision makers. So this is making a relationship with Governor Healy. So whenever there is a bill that I need her to support, she's already my friend, so I can ask her to support it, or other legislators. We do a lot of events, especially getting legislators out on the trail or into conservation areas so they understand what we're talking about. Grassroots organizing is my favorite part of my job. That's kind of what I'm doing right now. This is inspiring everyday people to take action and to know when they need to contact their legislators when there's an important moment to speak up for the outdoors. So this one way you can participate in this is to get action alerts through AMC's Conservation Action Network. I'll tell you how to sign up for that later. Become a member of an AMC chapter and go to local chapter conservation events. And part of what else I do is build relationships with community-based organizations that are helping people get outside so that I can tell them when it's a good time for them to contact their legislators. And then something else we do, which is more to like the general public, is just media and comms. I do a lot of communications with the press, social media, writing op-eds, and internal AMC communications to our members and chapters to let them know about our advocacy work and to just create more public sentiment for the things that you guys were just talking about, understanding that protecting land and protecting biodiversity is a natural solution for climate change. So I'm going to talk specifically about I'm going to talk first about federal advocacy that AMC has going on, and then I'm going to talk about some local Massachusetts issues. So the federal stuff is crazy. In the current landscape, meaning in the current context of what is going on in the current administration and all of the uncertainty that is happening at the federal level. So right now we have a new administration. We have the Republicans control all three branches of government right now in Washington, and that is creating some challenges for conservation and the outdoors. So on an AMC level, AMC is a federal contractor. We have huts in the White Mountain National Forest that we work very closely with partners at the National Forest Service to maintain these huts and these facilities. So right now, there's been currently a freezing of all funds being dispersed to nonprofits or state agencies, and this is affecting AMC in lots of many different ways. We have federal funding that we rely on for environmental monitoring projects in the White Mountain National Forest. The New England National Scenic Trail in Massachusetts is a unit of the National Park Service, and our full-time staff member is 100% funded by the National Park Service. We have a land acquisition project, which is in Maine, and the funding for that is currently at risk. So basically, there's a lot of money that we are currently waiting to see what is going to happen to it. And then there are some other impacts going on that are less related to do specifically with AMC, but just generally what's going on in the world. You might have heard that there is a federal hiring freeze, and there's also been a lot of workers who have been either laid off or asked to take a buyout option to leave their role. This is affecting a lot of the work that we do. We work very closely with the National Park Service to do actual trail work and maintenance, and if those staff are not there, we cannot work with them. And just like I was just talking about, there's currently a grant review of all of the contracts that happen with the federal government, but because there's less staff, this grant review process is taking a lot longer than it should. So while we are waiting for our money to come through, but we also don't know who's reviewing it because maybe they got fired. Third, there's been a bunch of funding freezes also to state governments for climate policy. So a lot of the stuff that Scott was talking about, like flood resilience and solar siting and clean energy infrastructure, a lot of those programs have been frozen. So our state governments are scrambling to fill in their budget gaps, which is affecting other programs that AMC relies on. So Massachusetts and Maine have been particularly singled out as targets by the current administration because we have blue state governors, and we are waiting to see what is going to become unfrozen and what's going to become frozen. All to say that I really don't have a lot of answers, but just all of the uncertainty makes it really hard to plan for next year and really makes it impossible to plan for how we're going to meet those goals for 2030 and 2050. So AMC's strategy moving forward in this really uncertain federal landscape that we're talking about. I recently went to DC to meet with our delegation from Massachusetts and Connecticut to talk about these issues. And honestly, we had a really promising conversations about trails funding. Trails and the outdoors and land conservation is a very bipartisan issue that we have Republicans and Democrats that are willing to stand up and fight for our federal funding, which is really, really a good place to be in. We have an inside strategy and an outside strategy. So the outside strategy is we're trying to change the landscape. We're trying to change the perception of members of the public so that they understand that federal workers are the people that are protecting their clean air and water, making sure forests are run safely, or making sure that they have access to trails and national parks that we all love and enjoy. So educating members of the public, doing events like this, going to the press, talking about how the things happening in Washington are affecting real things on the ground for people here in Massachusetts. Our inside strategy is we're working with Republican allies to push back where we can for the programs that are most important to us. So in New Hampshire, the governor is a Republican, Governor Ayotte, and she's been really helpful for AMC to go directly to Republican leaders in Washington to advocate for our trails funding in the White Mountain National Forest. And then third, we're shifting our focus to focus more on state policy work and creating dedicated sources of funding for conservation at the state level as funding for things at the federal level becomes increasingly unclear and uncertain. And we're also looking at private funding sources where possible for our trail projects. So Massachusetts advocacy, this is my wheelhouse for the most part. AMC has 3 legislative priorities this year in Massachusetts. The first thing that I'm advocating for is the Trails for All Act. And this bill is really exciting. I'm working with trail users with disabilities, so people that use wheelchairs or other mobility aids to access the outdoors. And we are advocating to create a dedicated source of funding specifically for universally accessible trails. So if you have never been on a universally accessible trail, it's like a normal trail, except for it's a little wider. It usually has gentler grades. It has signage that's really easy to read and understand for people that maybe are experiencing blindness or have other learning disabilities or issues. And so that is one thing that we are advocating for. And you can send a letter right now to your representative to ask them to support this bill. And then we're also advocating for this bill called the Nature for Massachusetts bill as part of the Nature for Massachusetts Coalition. And this bill would create a dedicated source of annual funding for climate resilience, land protection, and outdoor recreation, and it's estimated to be over $100 million a year. We are attempting to do this by diverting a portion of the sporting goods sales tax. So it's the sales tax that everybody already pays whenever they buy camping gear or a new basketball or even a pair of running shoes. Instead of that money going to like the general operating budget, it would go into a specific fund specifically for climate resilience and land protection. And that fund would be administered by the government and doled out to municipalities and nonprofits to create new parks in their towns, engage in climate planning and resilience projects, and expand access to the outdoors through outdoor recreation and trails. And then the third thing that we're advocating for is the environmental bond bill. So bond bills, if you don't know, are legislative vehicles for state governments to borrow large pots of money for capital and infrastructure projects. So every 5 years in Massachusetts, there is an environmental bond bill. Bond bills are usually themed through some sort of like the environment. And this is the way that the state funds lots of big environmental programs and projects. And so we are using this. So all to say that the state doesn't really pass individual bills because it takes a really long time to pass a bill, but so when there's a bond bill like this, it's a legislative vehicle to try to attach priorities like this. So I'm advocating to get the Trails for All Act and Nature for Massachusetts to be attached to the environmental bond bill so that they could all pass at once, because I know they're going to pass this bill anyway, because that's how they fund the government. I understand that might be confusing, so we can have questions. And then, so what does advocacy actually look like in action? This is me at an event on an accessible trail with my disabled trail user advocate partners and some other AMC members. And these are some just pictures of things that I do and AMC members do every day to advocate for the outdoors. So this is me in DC with my colleagues, and this huge man is, he's the staff person for Congressman McGovern in Western Massachusetts. That's me at the Massachusetts State House, about to go in and advocate on behalf of AMC. This is a picture of me and my colleague Miriam leading a hike for people with disabilities out on the New England National Scenic Trail. And this is a recent briefing I led for state legislators on the budget here in Massachusetts. And how can you get involved? Like I said before, you can join AMC's Conservation Action Network so you can get alerted about times for you to speak up for the outdoors and contact your legislators in support of the things I was just talking about. You can get involved in community science, like Peter and Scott I think have already talked about. Download iNaturalist and go outside and take pictures of plants that are in your neighborhood or on the trail when you're outdoors. And this is really helpful for AMC scientists and other scientists across the world to see the difference in when plants are blooming, when they're emerging, and when they're going away each year as climate change is affecting our seasons and our plant behaviors. And I encourage you to just talk to your representatives generally, like about issues that matter to you and see what they're working on. It's really important now more than ever to be involved in local and state politics. So if you have the opportunity to talk to your municipal or state representatives, I definitely encourage you to do so. And if you have the time, definitely encourage you to get involved with municipal government too, and your local town's conservation commissions, because that's really a lot of ways that trails get built and lands get preserved forever. Thanks. And now we're all available.